Hi guys. Okay, I think we have just about enough people joined in. So today we were thinking of discussing about the electricity tariffs that we saw take place, I think about a week ago. With I think it was a flat increase of about 66% across the board, with it being about 265 at the lower strata and regressing as you go above. So today what we wanted to do was a lot of talk was around increasing tariffs and making cost-effective pricing when it came to unit charges and whatnot. What we wanted to do today was to talk about what exactly the way forward is with now that PUCSL has agreed to these tariff changes. What does our future look like, and what can we as the consumer expect to see as time goes on, and what else we can look at in order to make sure that we can hold our deliverables accountable. Dhananath is just joining us. Hi, Dana. Good to
Hi,
see you
Akhila.
too.
Good
I'll
to
just
see
fill
you.
in everyone about what we were planning on talking about.
Yes, so today we are going to discuss about the electricity tariff hikes, and everyone was concerned, and there were protests, and people were complaining. So we thought let's discuss about the electricity tariff hikes and what we should do about it, and what are the ideal solutions to overcome from it. By the way, your chair is really cool. It's like I'm having a conversation with someone in a racing car,
Thanks,
and
Dana.
yeah.
You pay a lot to make sure your lumbar support is there, especially when you're sitting for most of the days. Right.
Great. So, what are your thoughts, Akila, on the
Yeah, let's get
electricity?
into the meat of
Yeah,
it.
let's get the conversation going. I think few people are joining.
On.
Yeah, yeah,
No, so first what I want to do is a lot of people seem to be confused as to why we are at the juncture we are at and as to why we increase these prices, right? So first and foremost, I thought we could break down into what the
yeah,
word, this buzzword, cost-effective pricing that has been thrown around by a lot of the parties involved, what it essentially means and whether it is exactly
yeah.
cost-effective in status quo in Sri Lanka. So in a summary or in a nutshell, cost-effective means, at least on the outset that whatever goes into making producing a unit of electricity would be reflected in the way that they are charging us consumers, and therefore there would not be a net loss in what is occurring on the end of CEB and incineration. So now the problem with that is when you bundle it up in terms of costs, and when we as a consumer are unaware exactly as to what the costs are, whether it's operational costs, whether it's staff personnel costs, the increments that they're given, their salaries, whatever benefits that they're given, or is it just, the input of coal or fuel and whatnot. And that's, I think, something that we need to dive into when we're talking about tariffs.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Akhil. I think there are a couple of sentiments that I overheard. Like people thought, okay, now they have a power cuts starting from 12 hours for 1.5 hours or 3 hours, and without rain or without any change in the circumstances, they increase the tariff by 66%, and all of a sudden there's power for 24 hours. How can that be possible? Because we were told that, no fuel, and then you just increase the rates and everything was back to normal. How this happened was the main question. And it's a serious hike, like 66%, and earlier was also there was a hike. So I think what we need to understand, I mean, as you mentioned, just to put things into perspective. So basically, we have to understand the dynamics of power. This is all we are talking all about electrons. So there's a base capacity that you have to run, because you really can't, like, though we are just switching on a light and the electrons has to flow basically, but you can't really store it somewhere when someone switches on to the electrons to flow. So basically, there has to be a base electricity to be generated to keep your grid stable. And when the demand goes up, especially in the evening hours, there has to be enough power basically to run the entire system. So mainly, there's like a combination. You run on hydro, you run on thermal, you run on fuel, So there are multiple options that you can take, but it has to be real time. That demand and supply basically have to be matched pretty much till we get our batteries, like the storage capacity, to develop to some level. So I think what happened was to make sure that and at the same time the electricity board is like making massive losses, massive in the sense like we have been talking about it. Our pay tax expectation of collection for 2023, like that means everyone who, if everyone pays their pay taxes for 2023, they expect about 100 billion rupees. And then when, if you consider the losses of Ceylon Electricity Board itself, is about for 8 months about 130 to 117 billion. That is before the price revision. So basically, since the government cannot make that loss, they had to increase the prices. But the question is how, when you increase the prices, then basically you can pay for the coal and other whatever that is the requirement. But as you very correctly said, we really don't know whether what is cost reflective means, whether we are covering actually the cost or whether there's inefficiency inside the system which we are paying for unfairly, because we really don't have a choice to shift the supply of electricity. So I think that's something that the CEB can be transparent, because it's ultimately government. But I think rather than giving it at a loss, it is better to give it at least at the cost or with a profit. But that cost reflection has to be transparent, otherwise we really don't know. But ideal solution is to bring a lot of players, suppliers into the system. So if you're not happy, basically I move on. It's like my mobile connection. I use one connection. If I'm not happy, I will probably move to someone else. Those are my initial thoughts. Akhila, you have studied this like slightly in detail. What are your thoughts? Like, what is actually inefficiency, or is like, are we offering lower rates compared to others? What are your thoughts?
It's a multifaceted problem that we're facing in Sri Lanka right now. I think we do have a large amount of inefficiencies. When the power cuts first started, there was a lot of press release and press coverages about how there were these increments and incentives given to meter readers. There was a incentive for reading the meter, then there's another incentive for reading the meter correctly, as if that is not part of their job description, and so on and so forth. So, the entire notion of having an individual to go out and read a meter and then you print the bill, those are also additive costs that in the long term, and when you multiply it by how many users there are. So for example, let's say that at arbitrary cost, it costs about 500 rupees or 800 rupees to generate a bill, including the individual going to read and all that. For an electricity bill that would have cost in the previous tariff regime about 300 rupees, there's a deficit of about 500 rupees that is not covered, and these are systems and mechanisms that we can automate, that there are better ways in existing societies that we can reduce inefficiencies like this. And also when you speak of inefficiencies and also expenditures, moving into coal power and fuel generation, thermal generation, that incurs a cost as well, because there are global markets, and those global markets fluctuate regardless of how demand works in Sri Lanka. And then there's an additionally incurred cost there as well. And as some people may not be aware, CPC, Petroleum Corporation that supplies these fuels to, were giving it at a highly subsidized rate as well. Which is why we have a large issue of circular debt. When we say CEB is in debt, the question is as to who exactly, right? One portion would be the treasury, of course, the individual that funds state expenses, and also it goes to the CPC as well, because they are giving it as a loss, and then those losses of the CPC have to be covered by someone, and this circular debt keeps going on and on and on until something gives. And that's what happened with our forex crisis. We didn't have enough dollars, enough reserves, foreign reserves, to bring in the fuel, and then that led to a domino effect of us having to cut down fuel expenditure in terms of transportation and electricity generation as well. So I guess perhaps moving forward, maybe we can look into, as a state, we can look into private investors into non-conventional renewable energy, which is, stuff like solar, wind. Hydro is something that Sri Lanka has been in the past also heavily dependent on, and that is something we moved on. Because I believe with the incremental, with global warming and how, weather pattern changes, that there can be inconsistent supply to the grid. And speaking of, investing and as you were speaking about, getting more generation companies into generating of electricity, I read recently that the that I think the ministry had stated that the Adani Group is interested in investing about $500 million or so, or 2 billion, or some amount like that. So perhaps we are making a way that's going forward. Is there anything you'd like to say about that, Dana?
Yeah, Akhil, I think a couple of things. One is on this renewable energy business. I think there's a few challenges. One is I think we all agree with the current climate change conversation. We all want clean energy, and I think Sri Lanka is very lucky in that sense because of that wind. I'm not sure what you call wind corridor in the Mana area, which is I think the wind flow, or I'm not sure whether I'm using the technical word right, but that's quite strong. So basically, you can generate pretty much the enough energy or more than adequate energy to supply for entire Sri Lanka. But the challenge is now these renewable energy projects already there are other renewable energy projects which is going on with wind and solar. But one thing is these suppliers haven't been paid. So I read somewhere the CEB also wants to, because basically they are postponing the payment. So basically, if the suppliers get the payment, basically they can reinvest that money, that profits in other renewable energy projects. So then actually this can be accelerated. But they hasn't been paid for about a year. So if you're not being paid for a year, probably you go bankrupt. But since this most of the renewable energies, once you do that initial investment, basically the energy being generated, so you really need not to worry about it. But if we pay that amount, that really helps to get the renewable energy side moving. The second thing is the point that you made, like giving it to companies like Adani. I think we can't just give it single-handedly to Adani. I think that cabinet, and there was news story which came out that we have given to Adani. Yep. I think that's completely wrong because you have to, if you are giving it, we have to give it on a competitive basis. Because we really don't know the cost structure. We are just giving it to Adani. They will do the same thing that the CEB is doing for us. We really don't know the pricing. They will probably sell the renewable energy unit pricing for the same price that we are buying the normal electricity through thermal power, because it's a massive profit margin. So that is something we have to be really, really be careful. I think we are too late. I'm not, because we have also spoken about it. You really can't just give for a company like that. And now there's a lot of concerns also being raised on Adani, on their performance and all that. So basically, we have to keep that in mind, in my view. That's something very important, because otherwise we will be back to square one. So that's my initial thoughts on the renewable energy side. What are your thoughts? What are you hearing?
Before I move on to that, I just want to put things into perspective. When you said that there's not a debt with the CEB owing to independent power plants and small power plants. I think the Energy Minister on the 29th of January stated that outstanding debt from the CEB so far is about 12 billion to the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation. Renewable energy supplies are owed about 40 billion rupees. Rooftop solar, that is private individuals, individuals that have the rooftop solar involved and are providing that to the grid, they are owed about 4 billion rupees. Private power plants, another 80 billion. Coal power, and the coal payments for February itself was about 35 billion. And, there are other breakdowns as well. So to put things into perspective, yes, we do have, private investors. The problem is that they are also losing faith when, there's so much debt incurred from, CEB that's supposed to pay them back. And also, I think that's very true what you said about, that whole Adani imbroglio that we're in right now, is that there seems to be a repeating history and a pattern of non-competitive tendering processes, and where it's really nearly given out to a single entity as opposed to there being transparency. And that is, I think, something that we should all be a bit concerned about, because at this juncture where we can have reformation, to existing structures of electricity and the generation of it, perhaps maybe we should not default back into our old ways. Yeah. And also, I think, yeah, I'm so sorry, carry on.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I completely agree. And I think others can also share their questions and thoughts on our chat box, so then we can create the conversation around it. But I think what is important is because monopolies, whether it's a private sector monopoly or a government sector monopoly is not a good thing under any market condition. So now we are having a monopoly. And the thing is, this electricity business, there are multiple, I mean, it's not like a single business. There's power generation, power transmission, and power distribution. So now at the moment, these all three are together. Now, even for solar, if I generate power at home through my solar panels, I have to pretty much give it back to the same CEB grid. So that basically that really doesn't make the market efficient, because ideally, in an ideal world, if I generate power, I should be able to sell it to Akhila, who is probably living about 20 or 30 kilometers away. But of course, I can't do a grid from my home to Akhila's home. So basically, there has to be the grid where I can contribute and Akhila consume, and we sort out the payment directly, and we pay a charge mainly for the network. And I think that's what happened in the telco industry. There are some towers which is basically a shared resource, but the tower owner takes it separately from costing from each and every supplier or like the service provider, but it's a shared resource. So basically, you're making the economy efficient. So that's something we have to be really, I mean, the real solution to bring down the electricity prices is not just allowing the CEB to decide what they want to do. It is mainly opening up the market and basically first to unbundle, that you call unbundle. You bring the distribution aside, you get the power generation aside, and then you make the transmission aside, and then you bring the multiple players on each sector. So then there will be the choice for the consumers, like whom to pick. That's what I wanted to interject and
brilliant.
share.
That's what I was also looking at next. Maybe we could look into the discussion of there's been a lot of talk about, do we need to privatize, or can restructuring of the CEB happen and we can be independent on our own? And when I was thinking about this, I guess the big buzzword people throw around is that unionization, and the trade unions are not so good about it. So is restructuring, at least in my opinion, is restructuring something that we can really push forward for? Because I mean, historically as well, I think in 2009 or 2000, when the Electricity Act was to be passed, unbundling was a criteria that was material to that act. But with political persuasion and other sort of situations within the state, the unbundling was not completely done in a horizontal structure, where you completely take it apart. It was done in a more vertical way, which essentially led to nothing. I mean, in status quo, yes, CEB is unbundled, which is to say that transmission, supply, and generation are separate entities, but all fall under CEB. But that's not exactly what we're looking for, is it, when we're talking about unbundling? We want the three aspects of electricity and the distribution of power and generation, transmission, and all that to be not monopolized anymore, right? And also, I think that ties into what you were talking about, renewable energy, because I believe it was Professor Samarajiva who had done some research on it, where he said that even if we do get in these wind and solar energy sources, that technology cannot be handled by the grid that currently exists in Sri Lanka, and that infrastructure also requires some sort of investment, and that investment is not something that the state can bear to pay at the moment, unless we are trying to take loans from the international market, but it's not possible. So foreign investment is the way forward if we want to make improvements in our existing infrastructures and to make sure, that electricity prices are not monopolized just by the state only. And you are so right to say that, the lack of choice is something that is very abundant in the problem that we have right now.
And actually, the interesting thing is now people think, okay, let's assume that, okay, we will do it on our own, like this all wind turbines and all that. Let's do it on, and then there will be no forex outflow or something like that. There's a weird no. But the reality is like those all steel, that turbines, that cables, that copper, everything has to be anyway imported. So anyway, there will be a dollar outflow because even if you do it like by the CEB, you have to basically do a massive investment. So it's anyway worthwhile to do it through someone else because one thing is we don't really have the investment capacity. So I think definitely, I think there are a few things that I'm trying to bring forward. One is basically the unbundling has to happen and there has to be more players in the market in the first place. And okay, let's agree because now the world has moved from this for like sustainable energy sources or renewable energy sources because no longer you can't just do like a coal plant. I think India and everyone is doing that, which also we will also get the impact from that because of the pollution and all that. But we have to move to clean energy for sure. So for that, we have to basically allow the market system to work because that's how you make it efficient. And one thing I recently read was this concept called wheeling. So basically, wheeling is I'm not sure whether people aware of it. I found it very interesting. It's like I can directly, sell electricity to Akhila or whoever if I have the capacity. So basically, if I have an empty land, bare land in Hambantota or somewhere, yeah, basically I put solar plants and I basically generate energy. And then Akhila has a factory which requires basically reliable energy supply. So basically, I contribute from the power that I generate. I measure it and I contribute to the grid. And as we discussed, like Akhila and I pay for the grid, like the transmission for usage of the grid, and Akhila basically gets it from the grid. So as a result, there is like all the other resources which are unutilized can be open because since now I don't have that option now, there is no incentive for me to place solar panels in my Hambantota land because basically I can't sell it. I mean, even if I sell it to the CEB, I can't get anything done. So that is a concept that I think and those are the options which get when we actually have the choice. And then when the markets work, those options becoming available, I think that's a way forward. So then there are people who like, sell food and all that because it's pretty much an open market. Anyone can come and sell food. Of course, there are some regulatory processes you have to certify and all that. But then there'll be so many players who can produce energy and to distribute it and transmit. That's how I see it.
Very fundamental question that's been spoken a lot in this conversation is that when you unbundle, will that have an adverse impact on the cost? Since there will be intermediaries in the process, and I think that is a valid fear to have because when you look at other examples, like for example the UK, I think people were quoting that and saying, oh look, there was retroactive pricing increases and then charging to clients, and that caused a bit of an issue when it came to low income households. But I think that we're forgetting the nuance that we exist in Sri Lanka, and that we're not saying to have it completely privatized and that there'll be no market that there'll be no safeguards either. We still will have the PUCSA to act as a regulator to make sure that there aren't any predatory practices that are going to occur in a way that access to the electricity grid will be limited. And just like you very well said, wheeling is another way that things like this can be prevented from, right? Because if I am capable, if I have a land, if I let's say have a dam or a hydro system within my tea estate, for example, something that that the energy that I create there can be put into a grid of my own and then supplied back to the people of that land, of that area. So I don't think necessarily that this demonization of privatization, and thinking that somehow just because we'll unbundle and give it to private entities, that somehow you need can be suddenly costed at 500 rupees or some insane arbitrary amount like that. So yeah.
No, absolutely. And one thing I forgot to add at the initial conversation was now you spoke about the efficiency and the pricing, and you basically mentioned there was someone visiting every household and he writes a meter and he gets an incentive for that, and for writing it correctly, he gets an incentive. I think now recently we get like a printed, like a bus ticket, electricity bill, something like this. I think I'm sure everyone, yeah, something like this. So like it's printed, you can see the logo and all that. So actually there's this concept called digital meters. In fact, there were so many people who are also arguing with me on Facebook. Why are you pushing the digital meters? There are people who use like taking the connection from the connection itself illegally without informing the CEB. So all these things happen. But the point is, I mean, when you have a digital option, why someone actually visit like all 5 million households? Like literally look at the wastage that happens. I mean, in terms of that human resources, that transportation, that time and error margin, where you can have an easy digital option. But I understand you can't do it like overnight. But I think there are about 100,000 digital meters being distributed. And if you have that, basically you can correct you can control the demand on the control the usage on the demand side, because then we can go for the pricing based on the usage hour. So basically the main concept of electricity is every unit that we produce as electricity, the cost of each unit is different, because if you generate during the daytime hours, the cost is low. If you are generating at the peak time hours, which you are activating mainly the hydro, addition to hydro, the thermal and coal and everything has to be activated, so the price is high. So basically, when you charge a higher price during the peak hours, basically the people can use it very carefully and their demand can be lowered. As a result, the pricing can be reflected. That should be the ideal way to look at it. So then actually you are bringing efficiency to the consumer. They can also have a choice. They can see, based on the usage hour, they can manage it. And at the same time, there will be a lot of savings for the CEB without like sending people to every household. And there was someone made an interesting comment. So basically when they go and read the meter based on the last month date and this month date. So imagine if that person visits imagine that person got sick and visits the house like 2-3 days later. So probably there is a higher chance that when you read the meter that you can, you exceed that threshold of 90 units or 60 units and you are charged for that extra unit, because not anyone like basically keeping a tab on what was the last day that that person visited and what was the day that he visited this month. So those things can all be mitigated if you have a smart meter. And the good thing is actually the electricity is, Sri Lankans are lucky that our electricity, I mean, pretty much every household in Sri Lanka has the access for electricity, so which is good. But how we are going to improve it is the question. What are your thoughts? Actually, there was also a conversation that on the impact of national security. Now, if you allow to privatize or many players to enter, there's a concern on national security. They can just switch it off and then everything,
I mean, I think,
What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's not unfounded. I think, cross-border dependencies on energy, something that's so vital and something that, we realize as a state, how much it's taken for granted, how important energy is for day-to-day activities, whether it be business, commercial, or even just, living life, because we're so dependent on it. Surely, yes, depending on another state entirely on the generation and the supply of electricity is dangerous. But I think it also runs into this, I don't throw this word around lightly, but a slightly nationalistic, sentiment that we have, where we need to be the owners of everything that we produce. So even if it was Noracholi, for example, I think it was a minister who said in parliament, why don't we sell it back to the developers? And just purchase electricity from them at a certain rate. And there was a lot of heavy opposition for this, because the fact that it would be owned by Sri Lanka brings some sort of morale boost that I think is a little irrational in its own search, you know. I mean, because when we sign, if we were to get into, let's say, I believe it was from Tamil Nadu to get draw power, it won't be at their complete mercy. You know, we will still sustain our sovereignty. We will have deals, you know, in which perhaps the servicing can be done by Sri Lankan individuals, and you can create jobs. And there are so many more layers to this than just this very Hollywood-esque villain, where, you know, the supplier doesn't like what you're doing and they just switch the turn the switch off because they don't like some political agenda that you're pushing, you know, something like that. So I think while certain elements of it can be founded upon, I think the large rationale of it is slightly blown out of proportion than what it should be. And also I think it's very interesting that you spoke about the meter readers. I think anecdotally, at least in our household, it's very sporadic. You know, they come whenever they want to, and sometimes if you don't answer the gate, open the gate to them at their specific convenience, they write an arbitrary number and that's it. And you can't really dispute that. And I think even more anecdotally, I heard a lot about this digital smart reader, digital readers. When a lot of people were getting their solar panels involved, I think it's something that comes part and parcel with it. And what I've heard is a lot of the engineers are very reluctant to install these meters because, they fear that this automation is going to somehow render them without an occupation. And while that is a genuine fear to have, I think that at the same time that depending on technologies and advancing ourselves, also it's another opportunity if you can look at it in a way where you can create jobs. If it's installing of these meters, that's another job. Maintenance of these meters, that's another job. And that it's not, perhaps maybe we should stop looking at things in a glass half empty and look at it in a glass half full kind of manner.
True. Very true. I just want to add also on the privatization, Akhila, as you very correctly said, I mean, you can't just privatize everything. So what we need to do is looking at the broader perspective. Even if the government wants to stay on certain sectors, they can definitely stay. But I don't think just for national security reasons, just keeping it electricity actually brings the national security. Because in that case, now actually it's with the government and there's no power, I mean, till recently. And they have a massive power. I mean, it went for like 12-hour power cuts. You can't argue, you can't really bring the national security argument when you already have a 12-hour power cut. Only national security thing that I can think of is I don't know whether you can remember during the LTT time, they had the Air Force, so then basically they switched off Colombo's lights because they really can't, figure out the target. So that's the only national security I can think of when they have 12-hour power cuts. Otherwise, anything else is unfounded. But now, if you look at India and many other countries, basically they depend on power with other countries. But of course, there's a degree that they are not completely dependent on them. If they come to some level of course, these countries, they go into issues all the time. So we have to keep that option of generating power within the country, but it can be done by the private sector because India, I think they have quite reasonable rates than us, and it is companies like Apple and so many other big companies have moved there because electricity is a must to run these companies, and it's being provided by the private sector. I mean, if that's the case, I mean, most of those who are joined here are using mobile phones, which pretty much your data and your everything is there. So that phone is basically not produced by here. But does it really bring like a national security threat? All the data, your photos, your personal thing, everything in this phone. But it is mainly done by a private company. These phones are not produced by the Sri Lankan government. But your privacy and everything is there. Even the president to prime minister to everyone uses the phone. So of course some of them are tapped, including the citizens one. But still there is no threat for the national security. So I think that is not the way to look at it. I think there was a good case on Finland. I think Finland was depending on Russia for electricity, but when Russia and Ukraine went to the war, Russia basically said, like, you Finland, you guys are on the other side of the war, so we are basically going to control the electricity. So Finland had options, like they got the power balance from Sweden and other countries, I think surrounded by them. So of course, in any investment, the basic logic is you don't put all your eggs in one basket. So in anything, you should have options. So now the problem is actually we have put all our eggs in one basket, which is the EV option. And when they go bankrupt, I mean, you really don't have an option, and everyone has to pay for it. So that's how I see as a sustainable solution. And I think the recent news was that India and Sri Lanka's grid is going to be connected. I saw there was a news story that I think the Indian High Commission and Sri Lankan High Commission have signed an agreement. Do you have any thoughts on that, Akhila?
Not particularly, because I don't buy into that, national security narrative that's been pushed around. I think geographically, we are also limited to what access to other countries that we can have when it comes to, trade and whatnot. It's not like we can extend the line from Malaysia, with ease. So I think it would be the best for both parties because by getting another player into the market, there is some sort of accountability that can be held, right? And at least that there can be some sort of comparative. Because now, for example, if you look at the oligopoly that exists in the fuel economy in Sri Lanka, you have the state-run CPC and you have IOC. And, when you look at the Indian oil company, you can see that even with selling at the same prices, that is restricted by the government, not necessarily by the government, but like by the market, they're still able to turn profit and still keep efficiency high with their operations. So perhaps, maybe with us getting connected to the Indian grid, maybe it'll bring in more investor confidence, right? Because that's another issue we have. I believe there's a lot of talk of a lot of these apparel industries and manufacturers wanting to move their business elsewhere, because not being able to have continuous access to power can be a huge detriment, when it comes to putting in billions of dollars into developing manufacturing sectors, So perhaps that is something good into the future of Sri Lanka. And of course, the electricity crisis.
Absolutely. I think Ravindu had said trying to solve the energy crisis is like, solving energy crisis with solar is like organic fertilizer for food. No, I think that is true. I mean, you can't only solve the entire energy problem through solar because it's limited, and of course it has so many variables. It only have there are shoulders where you can when only the sunlight intensity is good that you can produce, like the efficiency is high. So definitely we have to have other options for sure. No two words about it. But the important thing is now connecting with this Indian grid. Just wanted to add my thoughts. So I think that this argument is mainly because now earlier I think there was a peak time difference because India, especially in the South India, since it's getting slowly industrialized, their peak is mainly at the daytime hours. Actually, if the country is performing well, your peak has to be during the daytime hours. That's because that's where the factories and everything runs. But unfortunately, in Sri Lankan case, our peak is during the night time, mainly because people watch TV and teledramas and all that. But ideally, if Sri Lanka is actually, if we convert to like a manufacturing hub or like if the industries are really working, our peak should basically shift towards the morning afternoon stretch. But the idea is, I think, when you connect with the Indian grid, as I said, like the electrons cannot be stored. So basically, you have an excess. If you generate extra, you basically can sell it to a bigger market. At the same time, if you are having a shortage without an interruption, you can buy it from there. But I think what we need to keep in mind is if you try to completely depend on them, then it's a disaster. I mean, then basically they can control us. So that's where the regulation and these contracts is important because we have to have a threshold. And as you very correctly said, like PUCSL, there has to be a regulatory agency. They are so important in a market system because they have to limit, they have to have the control of how much we are selling. I mean, basically how much we are going to depend on them. Because then, like in Finland happened, of course, we can have the options out. So connecting is important, but I don't think we should depend on them. That's very, very important. Yeah, we have to reiterate on them because otherwise our people will go and they just connect and after some time you just depend on them. And if something happens in India, basically we all have to stay in darkness. So that's quite important. But having said that, it's important that we get into a broader energy market. I think earlier there was this Indian peak was more skewed towards the daytime, but I think now India is also picking up. They have also slightly their peak hours have been shifted. But that's something that we need to think about in moving forward on when we get connected with the Indian grid. What would be the to having that proper regulatory and the agreements right and our protocols right, because otherwise it would be the next disaster in
Yeah,
my view.
that's exactly right, Dana. And I think perhaps, maybe statutorily and legally we can strengthen PUCSL to take a bit more proactive stance than to take a retroactive stance. Or, once something has happened, then they take action. Maybe that's something that we can look into, and maybe that and the empowering of the PUCSL, a regulatory body, can stem a lot of these insecurities and fears people have about privatization, or just opening up the market in general, right? Because that's what a lot of political parties have been trying to. That narrative is that they're trying to push. This demonization of initially it was the IMF, and now I think now that's settled, and now people have realized that's unnecessary. We're moving on towards electricity and that production of that. And maybe that is another narrative that we should push for. Perhaps instead of just saying no to privatization
Yeah,
or unbundling, maybe the argument and the energy should be spent on, maybe we need to strengthen our regulatory bodies and make sure that they are held up, they can hold these both parties, the
absolutely.
state, and once if we can break down the monopoly of the state through CEB, and these private contractors and these private investors, and make sure that at the end of the day, us the consumer is protected. I think that's what we can all hope for.
Yeah. Any other thoughts, Akhila? Anything else to discuss, or how should we take it forward? We have some questions. I think we answered pretty much most
Yeah.
of it. Uh,
I think there
yeah,
was one more about
yeah.
why we can't completely switch to a digital economy for booking and scheduling with the state entities, I believe. And I think we're slowly moving towards that. And I think if you look at it in the context of what we're trying to talk today to do with the electricity crisis, like we spoke of, digital metering is the step forward. That would help us reduce a lot of inefficiencies. It would help us better regulate the usage and have a better understanding of usage, because we're taking that human error element out of it, and I think that's something that is important. But other than that, Dana, I think we have covered a lot when it comes to this energy crisis, moving
Yeah,
apart from just the tariff increases, what we can do after, now that the tariff increases happen, as we can shout ourselves hoarse that it's unfair and unjustified, but now that it's happened, is there anything we can really do?
ab- absolutely. My final thought would be, Akhila, there's a monetary aspect, I think, with the electricity CEB losses. Now, what basically happens is when CEB lost about 100 billion, no, I mean, pretty much they have been making losses, and sometimes they, with the tariff hikes and all that, they make a profit. But when they make losses, there's a impact on the currency depreciation. I mean, you might be thinking how the hell that happens. So basically, when there's losses, and these losses are massive, as I said, it's there are 8 months loss is almost equivalent to the entire population's pay tax collection. That's massive. So this to bridge that loss, basically the central bank has to pretty much, we call it print money, or like, because that loss basically the treasury has to bridge, and that is also added to the budget deficit, income minus expenditure. So the expenditure side is high. So to bridge that, they have to ask for money. They have to lend money from the central bank. So basically, if the central bank, for them, basically what they say is they come to the markets and say, look, we need this 100 billion to cover the CEB. They are not saying it's to cover the CEB losses, but we need $100 billion, no, 100 billion rupees, and they issue a treasury bill or bond auction. And when the treasury bonds are not being bought by the people, so if the people buy it, that means people put their savings, their hard-earned money without spending it with the central bank, right? So basically, someone is cutting down their consumption, which they could have spent somewhere, and giving it to the central bank by expecting an interest. So then basically the central bank gives it to the treasury gives it to the CEB. But sometimes people, I mean, when you say 100 billion, people basically don't put 100 billion. So they put probably about 20 billion. And there's an 80 billion gap that the central bank has to fill. So basically what they do is central bank itself buys that bonds, and that's what you call the money printing. So when that money is added to the system, which is created to pay the losses of the CEB, that money adds to the economic system, and then the inflation pressures are getting high, because when you pay that loss, that basically to pay the salaries or buy coal or anything. And then basically it has an impact. And when you have more money, basically the demand for imports increases, because that money goes to everyone's, because that will, let's go for CEB engineers, for charcoal, or for whatever. And then that money is basically people go and buy more and more things, and that is added to buy. When I buy something, for example, if it goes, that loss is mainly for the bonuses of the electricity engineers. When they get the bonus, they probably will go and buy a phone, they go and buy something else, and that phone basically adds the pressure on imports, and they go and buy some alcohol, foreign alcohol, that is adding to the pressure on the import. So that's how the currency is getting impacted, and that's why it's important to have that cost reflective pricing. But as we very initially discussed, but it's important that we have a regulatory mechanisms, as well as I think there is no point just having PUCSL to manage a monopoly, because you just have like one institute. So I think that's another aspect that we have to keep in mind. This electricity problem we have to solve, because it affects everybody. Micro and small medium enterprises, all the businesses, currency, balance sheet, everybody is getting affected. So that's why it's important to have it reasonably at reasonable rates, competition, activating the markets, and channeling, looking at the broader perspective. But of course, we have to make sure that our energy is clean. On one hand, at least we manage like the mix, but also keep the geopolitical concerns, and don't put all energy eggs in one basket.
Yeah, I think we have pretty much covered everything that we could have within this time period, and in a more conversational manner. So I guess if you guys have any more questions, I think it would be prudent that you all follow our work that that we keep doing. I think we post a lot on our we do it through AdvoChats. We do it through our Reset Now podcast. We do it through, our explainer videos, or whether it be, op-eds that we write, or, just research in general that we do. If you guys have anything else that you would like to read up on, I think, paying attention to our media outlets would be fruitful. So with that, I think we have answered all the questions. Dana, do you think we have anything else to discuss?
Yes. No, thanks, Akhila. Thank you very much for bringing all those points. I think we had a good conversation, and please follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn and Facebook and on all social media platforms. And we are looking forward to these kind of conversations. And
thank you so much for taking
time
out of your busy day, Dhananath. So I think to the rest of you all, I think good evening, and I hope that this answered some of the questions that you all had. So with that, I think we're going to bid adieu. See you, Dhananath.
All right.
No worries.
See you, Akhila. Thank you very much. Have a pleasant evening.